Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships, and this time a cruiser replay. In keeping with my previous Benson game that I put up, I'm going to be trying to talk about this one more in terms of do's and don'ts, I suppose. You know, the last one was all about the importance of cap circles, and this is another domination game, so cap circles are still going to be very important to actually winning this. In fact, it's going to maybe reinforce that previous video with how this one's going to turn out. But this is much more about the do's and don'ts of cruisers. And cruisers, I think, along with aircraft carriers, are probably the most sensitive, if I can put it that way, class to being down tiered. Battleships and destroyers, it maybe doesn't matter so much because the inherent stealth advantage of destroyers, depending on which particular line, means that even, say, a stealthy tier 6 destroyer can still be effective in a tier 8 game, potentially. Being a tier 6 cruiser in a tier 8 game can be a very different experience because, you know, battleship guns tend to remain effective whatever the tiering situation. Whereas with cruisers, well, it's less the guns than the range, to be honest, because you don't particularly have a huge amount of armour on most cruiser lines, and it is also maybe not the most forgiving class of ships to just go for a new player generally. Although, having said that, you know, up to maybe tier 4, I think cruisers are generally very, very competitive, but after that you have to start being a lot more careful because you can just get hurt so easily. And you don't particularly get huge increases in cruiser firepower. And having said that, you know, there is the distinction between light cruisers and heavy cruisers in terms of the actual armament that they possess. But even heavy cruisers, it's all about damage over time, whereas battleships are capable of dealing a lot of damage very quickly. And the only real exception for cruisers is if they have torpedoes available, which quite a few lines do, but also quite often they're maybe a little bit on the awkward side to actually use in terms of either their range or the ability to drop them with how far you can angle your torpedo launchers. So cruisers really are more of a support class of ships. And, you know, ideally you have the battleships taking the strain, taking the hits, pushing forwards, but cruisers are a lot more maneuverable. They're generally stealthier than battleships, although some lines of battleships you can make pretty damn stealthy these days, so it's not that clear of a distinction overall. But you know, in theory, in principle, there are situations when you might be screening for a battleship, and other times you might want to let the battleship take the lead. Now in this case, it's a tier 7 cruiser, and I realise for newbie guides I've been putting up some fairly high tier ships, but the general principles still apply. You basically want to only do what I'm doing here, which is fighting out in the open over open water against targets that you outnumber or against targets where you are confident they are focused elsewhere. Now to begin with, when you're at lower account levels, you don't get the most useful captain skill for a cruiser. In fact, you just don't get any captain skills at all. They're locked off until you get to... I can't even remember what the account level is. I would have to look that up. I might have to do a separate video for account levels. But there is a captain skill that tells you exactly how many people are focusing you, how many people are aiming their guns at you. And as you can imagine, in a cruiser that's pretty important. So in that engagement there, I was confident that I wasn't being targeted, and if I'd started being targeted, I could have started to maneuver. But for the most part, what I've been trying to do in this particular battle on this map, especially as I'm bottom tier, is I've been trying to use these islands to limit the number of ships that can fire at me at any one time, which is just good practice in any ship. But it's especially important in cruisers because below tier 9, most cruisers don't have a heal, with the exception of 1 or 2 premiums and the British cruiser line, which are definitely not newbie friendly. And of course battleships tend to have a fair chunk of armour as well, and a fair chunk of damage dealing ability, whereas cruisers, you have to stay alive over the long term in order to rack up appreciable amounts of damage, unless, as I've said, you get lucky with some torpedo strikes, because if you do, you know, that can be a good damage multiplier, but generally speaking, it's your guns that are the most important part of a cruiser. The torpedoes tend to be a secondary source of damage. So at the moment I'm using that big island ahead of me to try and limit what can fire at me. In fact, principally it's just that enemy cruiser at the moment that I'm just trading fire with. Sometimes, you know, sometimes it pays to be aggressive in a cruiser, but I think if you're starting out in this game and trying to play down cruiser lines, which is not necessarily my recommended course, being cautious is probably the order of the day. And I have been relatively cautious up till this point, but this is the part where I start to break my own rule, and you will see how hard I get punished for it. Now, I've had a moment of indecision here. It's do I pull out or not? And I've slammed on the brakes, to having decided that actually it would be a bad idea to pull out and expose myself to a bunch of fire, but I'm spotted all the while, and that's going to cost me dearly. So that's about, what, 30 to 35% of my hit points just gone. And now, because I'm in this situation where I'm slow and manoeuvring and you know, trying to turn around, that makes me a very attractive target for the enemy carrier. And generally speaking, cruisers are the anti-carrier class, but only some cruisers are. I don't actually have the defensive AA consumable, which is not really going to be a thing at lower tiers anyway, but now I'm even worse off than I was before. So it can go very badly wrong very quickly in a cruiser, and if I was in a battleship I would at least be able to heal some health back at this point. But now my fighting effectiveness as a cruiser has dramatically decreased because I've made one particularly silly mistake. And, you know, I'm an experienced player, relatively speaking, so it's entirely possible for an inexperienced player to do these things without even realizing that they're making mistakes, just to get punished very hard very quickly. I mean, the source of it is the fact that with the way damage works in World of Warships, some areas of the ship are more important in terms of others. And generally in battleships those are very well protected, but in cruisers, because you don't have a lot of armor, yeah, it is entirely possible and indeed probable that you will take a fair bit of citadel damage, as it's called, and that can knock off a huge amount of hit points very quickly. So I'm actually just trying to get away at this point, and I have managed to get some torpedo damage into that Indianapolis, but as you can see we're starting to lose control here. We've had 2 cap points, so we are ahead on victory points, even though we are slightly behind on ships at the moment. But the enemy team has started to push across, and now we are struggling to hold them back, to retain control, and thereby win the game. And as for my own position, well, I'm on fire. And I really can't afford to be on fire, and I'm basically going to get the full duration of this fire, and I have no idea at this point if I'm going to live. So, yeah. There are arguments to be made. Certainly people have been arguing for a while that more cruisers should get access to a heal, but as I've said, it is only the British cruiser line, and those are particularly squashy and vulnerable as cruisers go. So, yeah, Wargaming basically brought those out with a heal from the start. This is getting very close to me burning out. 38 hit points, there we go, it's fine. 38 hit points is fine. But the other thought I have had is that what you could possibly do is introduce a mechanic that is currently in World of Warplanes, another Wargaming title. And how it works there is that if you are out of combat for a certain length of time, there's a passive heal mechanic, and I think it's something like 30, 45, maybe even a minute in terms of how long it takes, but you can, just by being out of combat, heal up to something like 20% of your health at a guess. I don't know the exact number, but it's around 20%, it looks like. So it occurred to me, having gone and played a bit more World of Warplanes since the 2.0 update, versus having not played any for a long time before that, that actually for cruisers in warships that don't have their own heal consumable. That could work. That could actually work. That you just, if you're in a position like I'm in this Yorck here, where I'm really, really hamstrung in terms of what I can do and where. I'm actually still spotted at the moment. I'm air spotted. You know, if I wasn't, if there wasn't carriers or float planes or whatever, this would actually be a slightly safer position. But yeah, everything and anything can kill me now with just one hit. Whereas if I could sit here and not fire my guns for, say, 45 seconds and heal back up to 20% of my hit points, or even maybe a quarter of my hit points, just as a passive heal, I think that would be a pretty useful tool for cruisers, because it wouldn't necessarily like it would stop you being in this situation and just being useless. And because it's not an active heal, you know, it represents quite a different mechanic. You could even maybe have it so that cruisers that have a heal consumable, while they have any of those heal consumables left, just don't get the benefit of the passive heal, for example. You know, there are different ways that you could do this. But it would mean, I think, overall that cruisers, you know, as long as you could get away and hopefully be unspotted and you know, be able to make use of various islands that may or may not be around, because some maps are better for cruisers than others just inherently, then it could extend your lifespan. It could mean that you could end up not being in a situation like this where there's not really a lot that you can do, because the moment that you get spotted, I mean, I took a tremendous risk coming out and shooting at that Fiji, and it was a good thing that somebody else did finish off that Fiji, but it means that, you know, I can maybe get off the odd shot like that where I know I'm about to pull into cover, and then I can basically get unspotted again because I'm out of the line of sight. Which is just, you know, sometimes that's a good idea in cruisers anyway. Fighting in open water with cruisers generally is you know, you want to use islands, you want to be using your stealth advantage. So cruisers just generally, yeah, they're a tricky class, I would say, at the moment in the current meta for World of Warships. And you saw earlier how easy it was to get punished for making just a single mistake in a way that it's reasonably hard to do in a battleship, unless that mistake then involves taking a broadside full of torpedoes, which can also take off a huge amount of health, if not just outright kill you. So even though it's relatively puny destroyer guns on 38 hit points, yeah, it was just a matter of time really. But the good news is that we are ahead on points. We are recapping B, and there is still a chance we can win this, because we're very close to the 20-minute timer. And if we end at 20 minutes with more victory points than the enemy, that basically means we've won. But it really does come down to this Missouri, because if the Missouri sinks without sinking anything themselves, then they're in trouble. So rather than try and like, they're not going to be able to cap, although they've at least been blocking the enemy from getting victory points by being in the cap circle. Rather than turning to try and deal with the Yugumo, they managed to take out that cruiser, which was worth more points than a destroyer anyway. So although it's awfully close on points, and the enemy team, if this had gone on any longer, you know, they would have won on just overtaking us, we were actually able to scrape by with a victory. And I was able to get a little bit of damage towards the end when I had very little health, but my fighting effectiveness was basically nil at that point. So yeah, it's hard to recommend cruisers as a starting class, although I think technically all of the tier 1 ships are actually, you know, classed as cruisers, and you do have to play through the low tier cruisers to then get to the battleships. But I would say beyond tier 3 and tier 4, for newer players, battleships and possibly destroyers are the way to go, because cruisers, once you start to hit tier 5 and above, little mistakes, and sometimes not even making mistakes, sometimes just getting unlucky, get you punished so excessively, it can feel like that it makes it difficult. And it actually, I think it's relatively well reflected at the moment in especially high tier matchmaking. There are plenty of games when there just aren't that many cruisers. You might get 2 or 3 cruisers per team, and the rest is all battleships and destroyers, and it's reflective of the fact that cruisers are maybe not that fun to play, especially at the high tiers, just because of their nature at the moment. So I don't know if my idea of, well, not even my idea, it's, you know, it's from World of Warplanes, if that idea of a passive heal back up to a certain percentage of the hit points would make the cruiser experience better. But anyway, you know, you can still get decent results out of cruisers, but it can be hard work. And this was a decent Yorck game, even though I had that massive screw up, getting nearly 100k damage when bottom tier and getting to be top of the team list. You know, that's not half bad. And I did at least show off some good gameplay before I made the mistake and then paid for it so dearly. So hopefully you found this replay useful, and if you did, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.